Let's talk about common ground. I hear a lot of people talking, both professionally and on podcasts, talking about common ground. Today I listened to Chase Hughes interviewed by Pete Turner. Pete was talking about how he feels important common ground is. And Chase agreed, and though Pete went into detail, Pete Turner, I look forward to being interviewed by Pete to talk about things like common ground. And I want to reference Chris Voss. Chris is really seems important, talking about the information he's discovered, provided to him, or found information by others. And so common ground, Chris Voss says the only time common ground works is geography. And I'll explain it in my own way best I can. I agree with Chase Hughes in that you can't LinkedIn a course into common ground. And like Chris says, that really is geography. So how can I explain that? If two Canadians from different provinces meet in Mexico, it's like they're neighbors all their life, they're best friends. Better than that is where maybe two Albertans meet in a different province and never met, and they could be from the same town, a small town, rural Alberta, never met, and all of a sudden in a different province it's like they're best friends, like they're neighbors, like they grew up together. And so I really had a great experience last week that perfectly explains the phenomenon of common ground, where it's not a matter of serving in the military together. It's not a matter of serving in the same unit. It's not even a matter of serving in the same trade to have common ground. That really doesn't work. And so there's a guy I hadn't seen in 10 years that I used to haul logs with. We're on the same log haul, not just in the same mill, we were on the same haul, working side by side. We crossed paths every day, twice a day. We met in person probably 6 times over 4 years. Stood side by side about 6 times in about 4 years. Crossed paths every day. Now, I recognized him. I didn't remember his name. I asked if I could sit with him for breakfast at the coffee bar. And he said, yeah. I said, we used to haul logs together 10 years ago. And he said, cool. And we spoke a little, exchanged a few words. And then I said, well, I was the Army guy. Everything changed as soon as I told him I was the Army guy. All of a sudden, he knew who I was. His smile, ear to ear. Great big grin, just about come out of his seat to give me a bear hug. That's not, well, that's common ground because we worked on the same ground, but it wasn't enough. That's where geography works. We worked on the same ground. I mean, we're driving trucks, so we wouldn't be shaking hands every day, but we'd talk on the radio every day, crossing paths. And but he had, as soon as I told him who I was, he immediately knew, and he just, great big grin on his face. He could relax because he knew who I was. He knew that I wasn't just some weirdo. I mean, I'm a weirdo anyway, but I'm his kind of weirdo. So, obvious. Well, at least he didn't hate me. The grin on his face says he didn't hate me. So, but that's the importance of geography in common ground. You have to be from the same ground, and there's different levels of common ground, obviously. I mean, it sounds crazy to say that just because we worked on the same log haul that we're going to be best friends. I mean, we were on the same log haul, but he didn't give a rat's ass until he knew exactly who I was. So it's not just about common ground. And it has to be geography, like Chris Voss says. But more importantly than that, they have to know who you are to have common ground. And you can't build a relationship. There's trust. There's minimal amounts of trust there because he knew who I was. And as soon as he knew who I was, he could relax because his brain took a deep breath of fresh air and just put him at peace, put him at ease. But that doesn't mean that we're gonna, like Chris says, that doesn't mean we're gonna make a deal just because we have common ground. And so, how can I go into detail some more about that? I have had other thoughts on the importance and significance of common ground. And so I wonder if that's my date. No. So, common ground, geography. We have to be from the same ground to have common ground. There's no other way. And then there's different levels. So, because we're on the same log haul, that's got me sitting at the table. That's all that did. He might allow me to sit at the table anyway, but just because we're on the same log haul, all that did is allow me at the table. But as soon as he knew who I was, the smile on his face looks obvious that there's clearly a difference in the levels of common ground. So, I don't know how many levels there are of common ground, but I think that's a good point, is common ground doesn't work to get any deals, any favors, unless it's a friend, or me and him weren't friends, but we worked few guys hauled as many logs as the two of us put together, but and that's arrogant of me to say. But so I might say that's an important point. So let's right now, as I speak, let's draft some ideas on the levels of common ground. One is if you have maybe a working or common relationship in common ground. If you have a common relationship in common ground, then I would suggest that would be whether you like each other or not, you have a working relationship and there's an understanding of expectations. You know if you can trust the person or if they can trust you in certain situations, and they know they can't trust you in certain situations, and you know that you can't trust them in certain situations. And so that's one level of common ground when there's a working relationship. And maybe that's what it was with me and the other log hauler. Though I want to think that that's a separate and lower level of common ground, because he didn't automatically recognize me because we weren't shaking hands every day, we weren't rubbing shoulders every day. In that sense, in person, though we cross paths every day. So I still don't really know what he's like. I still don't really trust him. I don't know when I can trust him, and I don't know when I can't trust him. So I think that's a good point. Seems important to assume that those are two levels of common ground, and a third is just being on the same common ground from the same ground, from the same geography, from what's another word for common? How was I trying to say it the other day? From the same ground. So if we're from the same ground, it's a lower level of common ground. Greater degree of separation is a good way to put it. So I think I'm onto something. That's arrogant of me to say. Let me know in the comments what you think. And so on that note, if we're Canadians from different provinces and we meet in another country, that might be the lowest level of common ground. And if we're from the same province and we meet in a different province, that might be similar. No, that would be a different, because a person from Alberta would have different common ground than a person from Ontario or Quebec or in the Maritimes. So there's different common ground, greatly different though we're from the same country. So so that's a good point. So if we're Canadians in a different country, that's common ground in that we're Canadians. If we're Albertans in a different province or in a different country, then we have better, closer, tighter common ground, because we have the same culture, more or less. There's differences between northern Alberta, central Alberta, southern Alberta. And there's differences between the oil patch and the ranchers. And so there's different cultures within Alberta. I mean, there's different cultures from one side of the street to the other, though at least we're Albertans in a different province or in a different country, that's another level of common ground. Then there's, if we're from the same community, and how did I call it earlier, socially common, because if we're from the same community, we might not work together, though we might have common hobbies, we might know some common people. Though there's points of similar interests, and I think that might explain my working relationship with the guy on the log haul. We didn't live in the same town. He lived in a different town, but we worked together in the bush. But that's mine and his working relationship were different than if we were maybe friends on the job, because we could have been friends on the job. I've had friends on the job, and that's a different common ground. That's a tighter common ground. And so I think that's fair to say that mine and his common ground would be similar to somebody in the same town in a working hobby, interest, social environment, where we might be aware of each other, that we're not friends. And I think that's true too with any social interests. You might be familiar with somebody without being friends with them, and I think that explains where if you meet that person, like mine and the log haul trucker, I'd been away for about 10 years, so there was a disconnect, and as soon as he knew who I was, he immediately great big grin, and I think it would be a similar experience with somebody who's worked in a similar interest without being friends. They would automatically have a sigh of relief, and that's different than somebody who's friends with another at work or in a town. That's a different level of common ground, and a hobby or interest, or when somebody's friends, they'll have a different level of common ground, even though they might not be best friends, or they might not be socially active together, though in that work setting they'll have I think there might be 3 levels at work. Where you might be familiar with somebody in passing, where you might rub shoulders with somebody, and if you're friends with somebody at work, though you might not be friends outside of work. I think I'm onto something now to codify that. Common ground only works with geography, and there's different levels of common ground. Seems obvious there's different levels of common ground, and so you can't build a deal just because you're from the same town, same trade, military trade, just because we're both truck drivers doesn't mean that you're going to have a deal just because you're both truck drivers. So I agree with Chris, and it feels like it would be arrogant to me to say I think I've codified the levels of common ground. Seems important to talk about. Anyway, stop relying on common ground for building relationships. It's not how you build relationships. It's not common ground. Either you have it or you don't. Either you're from the same ground, and there's different levels of that. So it's important in neurology, in our survival brain, though it's not. There's too many degrees of separation.